Good evening, Key Biscayne. My name is Andrea Aga, your village manager. Thank you for joining us this evening. You may be watching us live on channel 77 or through our YouTube channel. This evening, we are presenting our third of four series on explaining what our GO bond program looks like. The topic tonight is finance and regulations. So we've had two sessions before. We have one final session coming up in a few weeks. The evening, we have a PowerPoint presentation. I will introduce our team and open us up. And then I'm going to turn the mic over to Mr. Benjamin Nussbaum, who is our CFO. I'd also like to recognize and thank Mayor Davey for joining us, Councilmember Petros for joining us, and any of our other elected officials who may be watching but not logged in. Thank you for your support and participation. I'd also like to acknowledge Chad Friedman, our village attorney, and Ms. Lori Smith. She is a partner. She's one of the attorneys with Weiss Sirota. Unfortunately, Jeff DiCarlo, who normally is our bond counsel, wasn't available this evening. So thank you, Lori, for stepping in. And Matt Sansbury, who is our financial advisor, who recently, I think probably a few days, perhaps weeks ago, onboarded with us with Hilltop Security. So thank you all for your support and help in preparing this material. So, Mr. Nussbaum, if you would like to please share your screen, we'll go ahead and jump in. I would like to ask that everybody let us get through the presentation. We'll try to go slow and take deep breaths. It's pretty dense content, and we ask that we hold questions till the end, and we'll open it up for Q&A toward the end of the presentation. So, GO Bond 101, Finances and Regulations, September 3rd. Again, this is our third of four presentations. Our next meeting will be on September 17th. So if you could go to the next slide. So it's important that we want to reiterate what the ballot language is. The November ballot is going to be pretty intense with the presidential election, and there's going to be a lot of questions on there. So we wanted to share with the community what the language is. This is your Key Biscayne question, and this is the text. This is what it will look like. So, shall the village issue general obligation bonds not exceeding 100 million in one or more series, maturing not later than 30 years from their issuance dates, bearing interest rates not exceeding the maximum rate allowable by law, payable from ad valorem taxes levied by the village to, there are three bond programs, mitigate the effects of sea level rise and flooding, protect village beaches and shoreline, and harden infrastructure to the effects of hurricanes. Shall the above described proposal be adopted? And then you will select either for bonds or against bonds. So a couple of things I wanted to point out with the ballot language. First is not exceeding 100 million. The village has no intention of issuing a single $100 million issuance. We need to spend down the funds that we draw down in a 3-year period, and there's no way that we can deliver $100 million worth of disruption to the island in three short years. So there are going to be multiple drawdowns, and we'll get into an example later this evening that'll explain a little bit on how that drawdown will work. I also wanted to put out, not interest rates not exceeding the maximum rate allowable by law. I assure you, our CFO, our finance director, and the council members who are voting on this now and who will be voting on this in the future will ensure a very competitive interest rate. And we'll learn a little bit more tonight about how the different funding mechanisms impact our interest rates, but you will get an aggressive rate. We will never, ever get close to the maximum rate allowable by law. We are in very good financial position with a high credit rating. And then again, the three program areas. So any of the specific projects that we would be doing would be directly related to those program areas. Next slide, please. Thank you. And with this, I will turn it over to Mr. Nussbaum, our CFO.
Good evening. So I'd like to review some of the checks and balances that will be in place. While the approval of the referendum that Andrea just read only requires a majority of the voting public, the actual issuance of debt per our village code requires a super majority of council vote, which will be 5 of the 7 members. Additionally, our village code has a unique debt cap requirement, which limits the amount of principal debt to 1% of our assessed property value within the district boundaries. Additionally, at every critical juncture of the issuance process, whether it be approval of the projects or selection of the funding mechanism, there will be both public hearings and opportunity for public counsel. Some of the state and federal laws we're restricted by is the state statutes require the majority of the electorate vote for the referendum to be approved in order to issue general obligation debt. And U.S. tax law, the Internal Revenue Code, has limitations on tax-exempt bond proceeds. They can only be used for capital projects and have a 3-year spend-down requirement from issuance. So the clock starts once you actually issue the debt. It's not when the referendum item is passed. It's when the date of issuance, you have 3 years to spend down those proceeds. While the focus of tonight is going to be on general obligation debt, there are other financing approaches available to the village. The village could issue a special assessment, which would require approval of property owners. It's a financial burden based on the relative special benefit to each property, and it would not be subject to the village's debt cap. Alternatively, the village could pledge their covenant to budget and appropriate, which is what all of the village's current debt is. It's a pledge of the village's legally available non-ad valorem revenue, which includes items such as utility taxes, franchise fees, and our share of state sales tax revenue. Covenant to budget and appropriate is subject to the village's debt cap. The third, which we'll get into tonight, is the general obligation, or colloquially known as GO debt, which pledges the full faith and credit of the village's taxing power. It's a financial burden based on the assessed property values, and it attracts lower interest rate because it's a stronger revenue pledge. It's subject to the referendum, which requires the approval of the voting residents, and is subject to the village's debt cap. And the fourth is a dedicated revenue source, which is a more limited revenue pledge, and therefore could reduce the credit quality. An example of this is the village's stormwater bond. We got approved for an $18 million stormwater phase 1 of the master plan, where the village is pledging its stormwater equivalent residential unit user fee to be able to fund the annual debt service on stormwater improvements. So the village is planning a coordinated implementation of large-scale resilience and climate adaptation projects. The actual GEO bond program would only require a portion of the total cost of the projects, as we work diligently with county, state, and federal governments, as well as nonprofits, to obtain grants and other favorable funding opportunities to minimize the cost to the village. So the total cost of these programs is roughly $154 million, but for the GEO bond program, for illustrative purposes, we're showing $98 million. As Andrea mentioned, the idea is we're not going to issue, and we're restricted from issuing $100 million of debt at one time. Because of the tax-exempt financing laws I mentioned earlier, we actually plan to issue 4 series of bonds sequentially every 3 years. As soon as you issue, the clock starts where you must spend down the proceeds within 3 years. For purposes of tonight, I want to focus on the first series of bonds, which is projected to be $25 million. And I want to show the impact and the burden on each property home of what that initial $25 million series of bonds would look like. One of the major factors in determining how much the annual debt service would be and the financial impact to each property owner is the village's credit rating. So the Village of Key Biscayne's financial strength and stability has been recognized by independent credit rating agencies, both Moody's and Standard & Poor's, reflecting the village's prudent fiscal management. The AAA and AA1 rating mean that the village will pay lower interest costs. So you see there on the right is kind of the rating guidelines of S&P and Moody's, and you'll notice the village is rated quite highly. Anything below about the line 10 or 11 is what are known as junk bonds. So obviously the village is in a much better position, and we'd be issuing we'd get a high credit rating, which would decrease the cost of issuance. So here's an example of how that initial $25 million, which is part of Series 1, would look on your tax bill. So this assumes a 3% interest rate. I'd like to mention this is actually more conservative interest rate projection. It's very difficult to project at the actual time of issuance what interest rates will be, but a neighboring municipality recently issued a $25 million general obligation bond with a similar credit rating to ours, and they received a 2.5% interest rate. So we're going to be a little more conservative and show this at 3% throughout the presentation, which I think is fair for illustrative purposes. It's important to note that less than 1/5 of your property tax dollars actually are retained within the village. The majority go to the Miami-Dade County School Board and also the Miami-Dade County operating expenses. So on the right side of the page, this looks like your annual property tax bill, which you will receive in November. And if you look towards the bottom in the green section is the Village of Key Biscayne local tax levy. The top portion is the Key Biscayne operating expenses, and that funds some of the annual operating costs such as public safety, building and zoning, and public works. If the general obligation referendum is passed and the village issues the first series of 25 million, you'd see a dedicated line below that which shows what the millage rate would be on just that to pay the annual debt service issued. So in this illustrative example, it would cost $16.30 per $100,000 of taxable value to fund the debt service on $25 million. Now I'd like to show the impact for series 2, 3, and 4. So on the last slide, I mentioned that per $100,000, the first series issued at $25 million would have an annual cost of $16 per $100,000 of property value. For series 2, 3, and 4, which we issue sequentially every 3 years, you can see the additional burden until all 4 series are issued, which would cost $65 annually per $100,000 of taxable value until the bonds are paid off. There's also a lag I'd like to mention in when you would actually be paying the tax bill. Because as I mentioned earlier, there's so many checks and balances in place. If the projects are approved in 2021 or 2022, the actual debt would be issued shortly after, and this wouldn't hit your tax bills. We're anticipating only until 2023. So there's a long time between now, the referendum item, and when this actually will impact your tax bill. So in 2023, we see the impact of $16, and then every 3 years, as the new debt is brought on, it will increase the annual burden. I'd also like to urge you to visit our website, vkbresilience.org. We have this calculator on the website. There's also specific instructions on how to locate your taxable value of your house or condo or commercial property, so you're able to realize what the impact specifically to you is. However, in case you haven't visited our site, I've tried to do the math for you. So I've analyzed our tax roll from the property appraiser and provided the median values of each type of property, whether you have a multifamily residence, a single family home, or commercial property. There's the median value, and on the right is the impact per that first series issued at $25 million of debt. So for the median condo, it would cost $93 annually. For a single family home at the median value, it would cost $244 annually. And for a commercial property, it would cost approximately $114 annually for that first series. There are certain protections to limit the increase in assessed value. So if we take a history lesson back to 1992, when Amendment 10 was passed, it limited the property valuation increase to the lesser of 3% or CPI. It's important to note this because we're discussing long-term 30-year financing, that over time, if property values do increase as well as projects, you're protected by this Amendment 10. It can only increase by 3% per year. There's also certain protections for non-homesteaded property. In 2008, Amendment 1 was passed, which provided a 10% cap on property valuation increases to non-homesteaded property. And a couple of years ago, that was made permanent, that 10% non-homestead cap. So here's how the debt capacity works in actual numbers. Every year, the Miami-Dade County Property Appraiser certifies our village tax roll. And for the 2020 tax roll, the Key Biscayne preliminary taxable value was $8.2 billion. Per our village code, 1% of 8.2 billion is $82 million in debt capacity. The village currently has $15 million in outstanding existing debt, which currently leaves us $67 million under the cap as of today. However, over time, I'd like to show that the current debt of $15 million will be paid off. This chart assumes no new debt is issued, and the almost black line at the bottom and the gray middle line are working inversely. So the bottom line is showing that the outstanding debt is getting paid off, and by 2030, I believe there's only $1 million of outstanding debt. So the gray line inversely moves up to show we have more room available under the debt cap. The orange line is kind of projecting where the debt cap will look over a 10-year period. Obviously, in looking at historical village numbers, our assessed property values, the village properties have increased tremendously over time. While we don't anticipate continuing on that same trend, for purposes of this chart, we assumed a 2% increase in assessed value over the next 10 years, which would actually have the village by year 2030 at around $10 billion, which would allow for $100 million of debt capacity. I think the 2% is a conservative estimate. There was an economic study by ICF for City of Miami Beach, who's implemented a lot of these resiliency and stormwater type projects, and they actually noted a 12% increase to those properties that were impacted by those resiliency projects. So even showing 2%, we'd be able to get to that $100 million. So in summary, the general obligation bond is just one of several potential funding options. The approval of the referendum just gives the village an extra option, which will allow for lower interest rates and longer term financing, which will allow a steady funding source and efficient implementation of our interconnected infrastructure resiliency improvements. And there will be public hearings to provide the community with a way to participate at all critical junctures along the process. So that's the conclusion of the presentation. We're happy to take any questions from the public at this time.
Thank you, Benjamin. That was great. So our goal here is to be able to specifically address any questions that the community has. We really want an engaging experience here for you. So today's presentation was a bit shorter than previous presentations based on the feedback that we've received from the community. So thank you for that feedback. And Pete, if you would walk us through any questions that we can answer.
All right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. If you have any questions for the panelists, please press *9 on your telephones now. Just please go ahead, it's to raise your hand. We have one caller, Madam Manager. It is telephone number ending in 574. Caller, please go ahead and unmute yourself now by pressing *6 on your telephone.
Hi, this is Jan Dillo, 350 West Heather Drive. Thank you all for having this meeting, and I hope you can hear me correctly or well enough.
Yes, thank you.
Perfect. I think you did an excellent job in putting forth these in this presentation. I'd like to hone in a little bit on the alternative financing approaches that have been that were set out. The GO, is likely to be the cheapest alternative, but I'd like to just explore some of the others to make sure that we understand exactly what's involved in each of them. So if I look first, say, at the special assessment, that does require the approval of property owners. And I know that there were a lot of issues with a special assessment in Palm Beach over the last couple of years that resulted in a significant amount paid in legal fees, but just to go into this special assessment for us, I just wanted to ask this, this question, which is, if I did a little bit of math, and if the first, the first bond that the first series that we're talking about is probably on the order of $25 million. And it looks to me like, if I did my math right, if you're going to do a special assessment, that would probably result in a charge to per $1 million of property value of roughly $3,050. And then for $500,000, it would be half that, or $1,524. And then every 3 years, according to the schedule that you've got for, estimated series, you'd have another basically, 3,600, then, 3 years later, 3,700, and then 1,500 per $1 million worth of value. So I guess my question to you is, we have a population where about a little under 25% of our population is over 60 years old. So what kind of enforcement mechanism would you have on a special assessment? Would there be a lien put on people's homes?
Chad, can you help us out?
I guess I can answer it. Sure. So with the special assessment, there is an option for the village to place that on the tax roll utilizing the uniform tax collection method. So it would be paid along with your taxes. If you did not pay your taxes, then a tax certificate would be sold at an auction, presumably, and the village would be paid back. If the property owner did not pay that tax certificate off within 2 years, then the holder of that certificate can choose to proceed to a tax deed. I mean, that's the general rule. There might be other, exceptions for homesteaded property and the like, but that's the general process.
So basically, if this special assessment were to go through and you ended up funding in 2023, if I had a property worth $1 million, I would either have to pay the $3,000 in incremental taxes on my tax register, or my house or this certificate would be sold. So I could either do that, or if we did this GO bond, according to your numbers, I'd be paying somewhere more in the neighborhood of like $163 in terms of an ongoing tax.
Just one other clarification. One other clarification,
okay,
and I'll let the finance guys speak to that, is a general obligation bond is based upon the assessed value, and there is a millage that's charged against the property. A special assessment is based upon a formula that is developed by an expert, making sure that each property meets the special benefit test, and it's not based upon your assessed value. So it's difficult to try to correlate the two, but just so you know, they're not, it is different in that manner.
Okay, so some people could end up paying, it's not based on your assessed value, so some people could
Correct.
end up paying a lot more, some people could end up paying a lot less. Okay, but at any rate, you're going to end up with a, every 3 years, assuming that this that everything is approved, every 3 years, there's going to the community at large is going to have to pay, for the first time, $25 million. The 3 years later, $30 million, and 3 years later, $30.9 million.
So go ahead, Benjamin.
Yeah, I'd also like to mention to the actual homeowner, one of the disadvantages of the special assessment methodology is that it would not be federal tax deductible as compared to if it was general obligation debt and based on the assessed value of the property.
Okay. I mean, it seems to me that the special assessment particularly given that there's a lot of people that have been talking about how difficult it would be to pay for an increased assessment based on the GO. It seems like a special assessment would be particularly unmindful of the economic conditions that we may be finding ourselves in the next few years due to COVID. So I think it would be very, very difficult, in my opinion, to get a special assessment through under these circumstances, or probably a lot of other circumstances. So then let's talk about some of the other ones that we can look at. So the dedicated revenue source, which we are using for the stormwater as a fee for that. Is there any other availability under that dedicated revenue source to fund, this potentially $100 million obligation? Can you still hear me?
Yes. Say the question one more time.
I'm just looking at the other financing approaches, because to me the special assessment is going to be very, very difficult to get through. So I'm just trying to get a sense of what the other approaches might cost versus, say, the general obligation bond. So I'm looking now at the dedicated revenue source, which I know we're going to be using for the stormwater. Is there any additional room based on the stormwater fee for us to fund these projects from that dedicated revenue source?
Right. So I think two things. Benjamin, if you want to maybe share that slide so folks that are following along with us can kind of keep track of the four financing options that we shared this evening. So to answer your question, right now, the process that we went by to increase the stormwater utility fee went to council, and we basically doubled the fee to be able to, using a dedicated revenue source, to fund specifically the stormwater utility improvements. So to answer your question, is there more room? Not by wave of our wand, but the council would have the authority and the capacity, should they choose, to leverage additional funding from that dedicated revenue source. The limiting factor and the reason why we landed at the dollar amount that we did was based on the construction schedule and the reality of how much we can deliver and how the pace at which we would require funding to be able to make the improvements happen. So that $18 million amount that folks might resonate with for the stormwater improvements represents the amount of work that from the time of issuance that we can make those in 3 years, the number of projects that we can make within that 3-year window. So, and then to answer your point specifically, so for those viewers at home, hopefully you can see the slide that we're on. So we're talking about item number 4, alternative financing approaches. Number 4 is a dedicated revenue source. And so the caller's point is that we can pledge a specific revenue source in the event of the stormwater utility fee. That is what the village has done. And you can see the third bullet point that is subject to the village's debt cap, unless the revenue is in an enterprise fund. We have 2 enterprise funds. One is stormwater and one is solid waste. Does that answer your question or no?
So we could use the stormwater though is pretty much done, right? You can't leverage stormwater anymore because you've got this 18 million against it, right?
Right now, that's exactly right.
Okay. And then what about the solid waste? How much, I'm trying to figure out if these are actually alternatives, how much can we do in a revenue source, a dedicated revenue source? Okay,
now I understand what your question is. Why don't we do this? Because I think we have a lot of folks who want to participate, so I want to make sure we keep it moving. Can I ask, may I ask if you want to send us your specific questions? I get where you're going, and I think for the community at large that is watching this, I think the message that the caller, if I may, is trying to make is that, yes, the staff is responsibly looking at all approaches to a funding mechanism. One thing we didn't call out here, but Benjamin spoke to in a previous slide, was, including grant opportunities, state funds, federal funds, other revenue sources. And to the caller's point, some of those revenue streams are tapped out. So I think one thing we can do, and we can put together an exhibit and put it on our website that illustrates perhaps a little bit more succinctly what the different funding strategies available are and how much capacity based on our existing portfolio exists within each and what restrictions exist. So we can build upon that. Okay, we'll do that, and then we'll post it to the website.
Okay, I just don't think that we have, I don't think that all of these options would actually get us where we need to be.
Exactly.
I think it has to be a GO bond.
Thank you. Okay, Pete, do we have our next caller?
All right, ladies and gentlemen, watching at home, if you wish to speak and ask any questions, please dial the phone number at the bottom of your screen, 305-365-7569, and then enter the meeting ID, 231-627-8415. And for those of us that have joined the meeting, and if you do wish to ask any questions, please press *9 on your telephone now. Ladies and gentlemen, if you do wish to ask a question, please press *9.
Well, if we have no takers, perhaps we go back to the first caller. I'd also like to take a moment and recognize Vice Mayor Moss. Thank you for joining us. Councilmember McCormick, I think I saw you join us, and Councilmember London, thank you as well.
Andrea?
Yes, sir.
We have no questions. I'd like to, listening to Benjamin's presentation, your answers, I was impressed. You did a great job, but I think you really misled everybody. And I think you misled everybody because listening, you would assume that the council has already decided we're going to have 4 tranches of $25 million each, 3 years apart, and this is the money we're going to spend for the various projects. I think you must make clear to everybody that we have approved nothing. We've approved no tranches, no amount of money, and no projects. These are the projects we're looking at. These are the estimates we have, not definite numbers, and this is the time frame we have. But the only thing people are going to vote on is the authorization to have GO bonds in the future when one of these projects become available, and we vote to do it at that time. So at this point in time, we have not approved the 25 million for tranches. We have not approved any of the projects. We have not approved any of the cost of any of the projects. And I think people, the most problem I hear from most people in these various chats is they're confused. They think, spend $100 million, get the bond, we're going to spend it tomorrow. No, now we're going to spend it for 25 million tranches. Both are wrong. The only thing they're voting for is to authorize the GO bond to be used as a tool in financing because it's the most economical long-term solution to financing that we will need in the future. But as of today, as of November 3rd, when they vote, this has absolutely nothing to do with 25 million a tranche, nor these projects, as far as the cost goes. And I think that should be clear to everybody.
Point taken. Okay, I think we have folks raising their hand, Pete.
I apologize, I was muted. I'm sorry. I still have the previous caller on the line, still unmuted, and then we do have one caller after that.
Okay.
So telephone number ending in 574 if you wish to continue. Telephone number. All right. Telephone number ending in 864. If you wish to ask any questions, please press *6 now. Caller, you are live.
Hello, this is Rose Haney, 472 Glen Ridge Road. On one of your slides, you had something about residential, that they would, for the first bond series, they would pay approximately 244 per year. And my question is, how many series would they be then, if that's just for the first series? Because I'm curious how much the amount could be, and then for how long would you be paying this increased tax to pay off the bond? Could you answer those two questions, please?
Yes, so good evening, Ms. Haney. And I'll turn it over to Benjamin, but I think to Councilmember London's point, I think it is important that everybody recognize, for purposes of explanation, we've put forth a 4-series program with nice round numbers that are logical and sequential from a construction and implementation perspective. But Councilmember London is correct. Each of those projects would need to be approved by the council. Each of the drawdowns, the terms of the debt, the terms of the financing, all those decisions would be presented to council in sequence before anything hits your tax bill. So with that preface, I'll turn it over to Mr. Nussbaum to answer the question about the illustrative example that we've brought forth to try to help folks understand.
So for the illustrative example, at that $25 million, taking the median value for a single family home, which is roughly $1.5 million, it would cost $244 annually. So since there are no series or tranches that have been issued yet, if 4 series of $25 million were issued, it would be 4 times that amount, which would be roughly $976 until they're fully paid off. One of the advantages of the GO bonds is that you would use a 30-year duration to minimize the impact per year on the
And I think another benefit, Ms. Haney, of the timeline is that you want to match at least the useful life of the infrastructure to the payment period. And so that's another benefit that we see here.
Okay, so it would be 244 times 4, approximately 30 years. Like 970, well, it'd be like 976 more if you had roughly a $1.5 billion assessed house.
So I think for both you and for everybody who's watching this and who will watch in the future, I think the specific examples, if you go to the website, you can key in your specific situation, your actual home, your actual condo, your actual commercial property. And we've designed a calculator that will be able to tell you the specifics for your case. Notwithstanding, I don't know, Benjamin, if you caught the numbers, if you have something you can provide. Otherwise, caller, if you want to, come into the office or call us, we can walk you through the website and walk you through how the calculator works and really come up with, based on a few different scenarios that we've discussed, what the impacts would be to you. Hopefully that would be helpful.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And could I just jump in? Is it possible to discuss a little bit more broadly our debt service that's falling off? And also, I don't know if you could share, I don't know that everyone is aware of the increased revenues we've gotten with franchise fees renegotiated with 0 additional cost to our residents, but a net positive revenue source for the village. And just so people have a little bit of an idea that this is not necessarily an incremental addition of taxes, but rather that we are currently paying debt service that we no longer will be, and maybe how much we could borrow in a GO bond with our current debt service and the incremental revenues from the franchise fees? Sure.
Benjamin?
Sure. So for the first series issued about 20 years ago for our Civic Center improvements, the annual debt service of about $800,000 has been finally matured and paid off. And next year, the Capital Improvement 2011 A bond, another $780,000 in annual debt service will fall off as well. So adding the two together is about $1.6 million reduction in debt service. Additionally, as Councilmember McCormick mentioned, we recently renegotiated the franchise fee agreement directly with Florida and Power and Light instead of with Miami-Dade County, which should double our franchise fee revenue from around $600,000 a year to $1.2 million a year. So the combination of those three items, whether they're expenditure savings because debt has fully matured, or as an increase in revenue without increasing the millage and putting the burden on the taxpayers, will give the village more flexibility to be able to pledge those savings to issue more debt.
Councilmember McCormick, does that help?
Yeah, it does. I mean, it might be helpful for people to hear exactly what that dollar amount is.
Translates to?
Yeah, what it translates to. I understand that it's not the same dollars you'd use for one or the other, but it's the same big budget, right? So if we're not using pay down debt service, we don't need to collect it in ad valorem revenue either. So to just have a little visibility into how it would translate, I think it helps to paint an accurate and clear picture.
So I mean, we can start by saying in the example we provided, the $25 million first series drawdown, the debt service, using conservative estimates, we used a 3% interest rate, which is, high given the circumstance now. The annual debt service to the village would be about 1.3 million. So I don't know, Benjamin, if you want to expand upon that, but that's kind of a point of reference. At a conservative 3% interest rate at about 25 million in debt, the debt service to the village is about 1.3.
And the debt falling off was about 8,000, and then an additional 600,000 in franchise fees.
So 800 falling off this year, 780 falling off next year, and then the additional 600 in franchise fees is fully realized in 2021, the upcoming fiscal year.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Can I ask for clarifications from either Andrea or Benjamin? You mentioned two things. You've been mentioning the fact that this is a 30-year timeline. I think it would be helpful for people to understand the longest timeline that can happen if we aren't using a GO bond, what banks typically allow for a timeline. And then secondly, if you could just tell, myself included, tell all of us a little bit more about how you found out the data about the property values on Miami Beach after their resilience projects. You stated that it was 12%, and I was just curious where you got that information and how you could correlate that to the projects that they have done.
Okay, for the first question, I actually want to turn it over to our financial advisor, Matt, who's in the market daily. He could probably answer the first one better about duration.
Yeah, can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So the GO credit itself isn't really what's specific to the 30 years. Most credits on a municipal bond basis, whether that's GO or the CBNA or a sales tax bond, most of them can go out for 30 years. So that's not really specific to the GO credit. You mentioned banks. Banks typically do not go out that long. So, really you're looking at a municipal bond if you want to go out 30 years. But again, the GO doesn't make it so that it goes out 30 years. That's just the cheapest way to go out 30 years.
Real quickly though, can you explain then you said it has to be a bond to go out 30 years, correct? Right
now in today's market, there are very few banks who are willing to loan over 20 years, let alone 30 years. So yeah, your options are pretty much limited to a municipal bond.
And I don't know if it's Benjamin or Andrea, can you tell us historically all the debt that we have incurred to date for the community center and other projects? What is the longest timeline that debt's been paid off in?
20 years.
20? Okay. So maybe you can tell us about Miami Beach now?
Sure. So that was, they did an economic study by an independent consultant, and they analyzed the properties that were affected. Miami Beach recently issued I think it was over $400 million of general obligation debt to fund some of the same infrastructure and improvements in relation to sea level rise. And those studies came back to show that those neighborhoods that had received infrastructure improvement, that the assessed value had actually increased by up to 12%. So obviously, we use a much more conservative approach in Key Biscayne, but I believe the study is on our website, or I can distribute it to you guys as well.
And then does this also show, I think you mentioned it, so I'm not sure, but does it also show how much the individuals are having to pay relative to the increase in property values? On their bond, their millage has gone up how much, and what is that on $1,000 value?
For Key Biscayne residents or for
Miami Beach? Miami Beach.
No, I mean, I didn't include it on the presentation, but I can find out.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Madam Manager, I do have 2 more callers.
Great.
The caller with the phone number ending in 062. Caller, please unmute yourself by hitting *6 on your telephone now. Again, that is telephone number ending in 062. Please press *6 to unmute yourself. Final, sir. Caller, you are live.
Hello?
Hi, good evening. We can hear you.
I'll circle around. We do have another caller. Caller with the telephone number ending in 574. Please press *6 now to unmute yourself. Again, that is phone number ending in 574. 574. Please press *6 to unmute yourself. Caller, you are live.
Hi. Thank you. It's D'Angelo again. I just wanted to ask one follow-up question. Since I don't think we can do a special assessment and the dedicated revenue source seems to be tapped out, does our financial advisor have an estimate of what the differential is to do a CBA bond versus a general obligation bond?
Matt?
Sure. It's in today's market, there's not a huge difference between the two. One of them is obviously paid back by general fund revenues. And so if you're applying those to debt service, you're taking those away from a different expenses that you need to pay with them. But in fact, S&P right now rates GO and CB&A basically exactly the same. There'd be a small difference, but it would be 5 to 10 basis points, which is about 0.05% or 0.10%, just to give you roundabout numbers. So if GO gets you 3% interest rate, let's say a CB&A would get you 3.10, 3.15 to be conservative. So it's not a huge difference, but there is a difference.
I thought that Matt, isn't there also Matt, isn't there also a difference on maturities when you have a CBA versus GO that you can go longer on the GO?
No, I don't. We see 30-year CB&A all the time. In fact, we are working on one right now. So I don't think that the length of maturity would be too much of a difference.
And do you ever see a difference in credit quality since the CBA is dedicated revenue, and particularly some of our revenues may be in flux, certainly with the sales tax revenue and the utility revenue in flux, particularly after COVID? Is there a credit quality differential?
Just to be very generic, if you wanted to put them in a tier, GO would be the best. CB&A would be second because it's a basket of non-ad valorem revenues. And then a dedicated revenue would probably be third. That's generic, but that's most of the time what you would see.
Thank you.
I'd also like to add the other issue with pledging the same CB&A non-ad valorem revenues is we have certain debt covenants with our current banks of our outstanding debt. So the more you issue pledging the same revenue source, the lower those ratios would be, which could potentially violate our existing covenants.
That's good to know. Thank you.
All right, Madam Manager, we do have one more caller.
Okay, thanks.
Again, the caller with the telephone number ending in 062. Please press *6 to unmute yourself. Again, caller with the telephone number 062. Please press *6.
So I will point out that we've been, oh,
Caller?
great.
Am I unmuted?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Good evening. My name is Ed Stone. I'm calling on behalf of the seniors who do not understand what's going on and would really request that a very simplistic summary of this meeting be published somewhere that we can look at it and study it, because it appears it's a good thing, but I'm hearing too many negatives that, oh, they don't want to pay. So I think it's very important that we realize that a lot of the seniors are now living on fixed incomes, and also their property values are declining some, but their assessed values are kind of remaining the same, but they're a lot less than probably the value of their property. So I think we need to explain that, what the assessed value means to all this. I heard some of the numbers with maximum $65 and et cetera. So I think it would really be helpful if we had a very, very, very simple cheat sheet to go out so that we can all understand it and hopefully pass this for the future of this island. And as seniors, we thank you for all you're doing.
Well, we thank you, Mr. Stone, for taking the initiative, and we've worked closely with you in the past to make sure that the seniors in the community are informed and aware of what we're doing. So I would invite you, we'll take a first pass at some material, and perhaps you can come into the office next week and we can run it by you and you can give us any feedback to make sure we get the facts out. I do want to make one point very clear. The village staff, we are not advocating, we cannot advocate either for or against the bond issuance. That is a decision of the voters on November, and then subsequent actions are going to be the decision of the council. So if anybody senses a little bit of hesitation in what we're saying and how we're saying it, we are abiding by that standard. So please keep that in mind. But to Ed Stone's point, yes, we absolutely want everybody to be informed. And I think everybody learns differently and everybody comprehends information differently, myself included. So we will try to put together a simple one-pager that really speaks to the facts and the questions that you're hearing. And I would invite you to look at that with us and make sure that it meets the objective of communicating honest and clear information. So thank you for that.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question, Andre.
Yes, sir.
Benjamin, how is the homestead cap, 3% or 10%, affected by the bond debt? Everybody should know that.
Sure. So for those that have homestead property, which I mentioned is roughly 31% of the village, their assessed value cannot increase more than 3% or CPI. So if the village issues debt, that annual debt service amount is fixed. So if you're a homeowner and your assessed value cannot increase more than 3%, it's possible your portion of that fixed annual debt service would be less over time, as some of those non-homesteaded properties end up shouldering more of the burden of that fixed debt service.
And you said, if I'm not, that the average or median home single family is $1.4 million, $1.5 million, or $1.7 million?
$1.5 million taxable value.
$1.5 million. So you're basically saying you go by $45,000 a year? Yeah.
Or CPI, the lesser, sure.
Well, take maximum $45,000, right? And if our millage rate was 3 mills, what's 3 mills of $45,000?
135.
No, the point being is that it would not satisfy this debt that you're talking about. So, and then you have the 10% on the other hand, right? Which for the non-homestead, which is basically this 78% or 77%, 79% of the people are non-homesteaded. And what happens when you have this debt, but the homestead cap does not give you enough funds to pay it?
The millage would have to be raised.
Okay. Good enough. But if do you have the cap, so even the millage is raised, doesn't affect the person who has the 3% cap, does it?
The millage rate would only apply to the portion you can multiply by, which is.
Well, why don't we ask Matt, does this situation ever occur?
And I'll let the lawyers also jump in here, but this is an unlimited geo tax. So basically, you charge a millage that you need to collect the debt service that you need. Where as opposed to a limited geo, which is we'll charge 1% no matter what. This is an unlimited. So if you need more, the millage rate goes up.
Now, my question is, when there's a conflict between that and the homestead cap, what do you do? Or how is it handled?
The mill, like I said, I think maybe Chad would, the millage would go up to whatever you need it to pay the debt service.
Raise all this high millage, but the person still doesn't pay more than 3% the next year. You understand where I'm coming from? I'm sorry for raising you stupid questions, but
it's not stupid. The taxable value doesn't go up, but that doesn't mean they're not paying more than a 3%.
They can't pay more than 3% in taxes.
It's not that they can't pay more than 3%. Amendment 10 says the assessed value cannot increase by more than 3%.
Okay, so what you're saying is the assessed value can't go more than 3%. So therefore, take that, the millage thing we're talking about. You see where I'm coming from. But all I want to know, what is the situation in that particular case? Do you just raise millage, or do you have a special assessment, or what do you do? I mean, it probably will never occur, but I want to bring it up now because somebody is going to come up with this question later. Okay, that's where I'm coming from.
I don't actually think it could occur because if values are going up, you're actually charging less. The debt service on the bond stays the same whether values are going up or down. So if values are going up, you're actually theoretically charging less millage to pay the bonds back.
And if the values are going down?
You're charging more millage.
Okay. So you're saying no matter what.
There's a caller a few callers ago who mentioned that the values were going down, but her taxes were going up. And the reason that's possible is because of that Save Our Homes assessment reduction, where the taxable value is still catching up to the market value. So annually it may go down, but
then a good percentage of our people, just floating a bond would not affect them at all, since the market value or taxable value of their house today is below the market value and it's going to go up by 3% anyway, correct? So this bond would not cost them anything. Is that right?
No, it would still cost all.
No, I'm paying right now. My property is assessed for $100. Next year it's assessed for $103. Okay, I mean it's good. Whether one way or other, it's still going to go up to $3 because the market value of my house is $200. So it's not going to cost me anything. So basically, 1% of the people here.
Your portion of the annual debt service, which is your $103.
Listen, people are looking what's going to cost them. The 31% are good part of the population. They're going to pay the increase of the 3% anyway, correct? Because of the difference between market value and taxable value. So all I'm saying is that people should realize that also, especially answering Ed Stone, because he brought it up before, and if you're still listening, a lot of the he calls them seniors. I'm not sure what year a senior starts being a senior, but the point being, those people, me included, possibly have lived here a long time. So no matter what, our things are going to go up, our taxable value is going to go up by 3% a year, our assessed value. So for these people, they really don't have much to be concerned about by issuing these bonds. Or am I mistaken?
I guess the point I'm trying to make is they won't have as much to be concerned about. They will still pay whatever millage rate that we deem based on the total property value. It just can't go up more than 3%. So they will be, I guess there's more limitations in place over a 30-year period, how much of that burden they would carry because of that Save Our Homes assessment reduction.
So again, basically, they're going to probably go up 3% no matter what. And this bond's not going to make any difference. Is that right? Matt?
I would be hesitant to say it's not going to make any difference. I mean, they are going to have to pay taxes towards the bonds, even if their values go up 3%. Now, if others people's values go up 10%, then yes, they will have to pay less proportionally than those whose values go up 10%. But they will still they will be charged taxes more than if there was no GO bond.
We have somewhere between 69 and 72% who are not homestead. Last time I saw it was 78, I think 28. Now Benjamin says it's 31. So basically we have somewhere between, excuse me, 69 and 72%. We're not limited. But the old time residents pretty much would be locked into the 3%, which again would be, a lot of them would be the senior citizens. So they really would not have a big burden from the state.
You know what we'll do? Maybe I can help out here. You know what? When we put together the simple kind of a one-pager, we'll make sure that we're very, very clear on those folks who have owned their home for a long time and who are limited by the 3% and the 10% respectively. We'll make sure to be very clear on how it would or would not impact those individuals, and we'll circulate that information.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
You had a slide that showed the property taxes, and then you had a separate line as a theoretical line for the millage set by the GO bond, correct?
Correct.
So I think to try to summarize what Ed is asking and what you're saying is that millage rate is sitting outside of the Key Biscayne operating budget millage rate, and whatever your assessed value is, then that determines how much you're going to pay with that millage rate. You multiply the two together, correct?
Correct.
So people are still going to pay, they're just not paying proportionally as much because their homes are valued under the actual value of the home.
That's correct. And as Matt said, over time, the proportion could shift, right? As other values are going up 5, 6, or 7%, if you're limited at only going up 3, your proportion of the total fixed annual debt service would be less. The other thing for those 31% that are homesteaded is there's also certain exemptions that apply to your assessed value, which is $50,000 against the Key Biscayne debt service millage.
I guess the one thing that I didn't understand, it sounds like the millage rate to pay the debt of the GO bond can fluctuate every year based on what's happening with its property values. So that rate is not fixed over time. It's actually fluctuating as if property values go up, the rate's going to go down. If property values go down, the rate's going to go up in order to make sure that we pay off our obligation. Is that accurate also?
Correct. So the annual service is fixed, but correct. The millage would fluctuate depending on value. If they go up over time, the rate would go down to be able to pay off the
And do you have real numbers that show that happening on Miami Beach, where their millage rate specific to the GO bond that they took out is going down over time because of the increase in property values?
So they just passed their GO bond 2 years ago. So there's not much of a trend to show the rates going down, but you would, yes, one would expect such a thing happening.
And we can look at what's at least happened in the first year, and we can see what where they land next year too, to start developing that trend analysis.
Okay, thank you.
The other reason why that might not happen yet is just like Key Biscayne, where they have a 10 or 12 year GO bond program where they're going to be issuing every 3 years. So because they're adding and issuing new debt for part of the program, you might not see it. It's still increasing. It's over time. Once it's fully issued, then you would start seeing the decrease as the property values increase.
And going back to Ed's point, we don't have a timeline set yet. That's just the proposal that you're suggesting so that we can understand the process.
Correct. No debt has been issued. No projects have been approved. It's just for illustrative purposes.
And no timeline's been established.
For purposes of our example, we framed a timeline, but you are 100% correct. These are all decisions that council would need to make after the voters make their choice.
Thank you.
So with that, we're trying to keep these town halls to an hour. So if there are any other questions on the regulations or the financing, the financing in general, about the GO bonds or any of the other funding mechanisms that we've spoken about this evening, please do reach out to us. The website, www.vkbresilience.org, is the village's website. There's a link there that you can reach out to us directly. You could always reach out to me. My email address is manager@keybiscayne.fl.gov, and we will respond to your questions. If we get a lot of the same questions, we are creating a frequently asked questions section on the website to try to address the most relevant and most commonly asked questions. And with that, if there are any of our elected officials who'd like to say any closing remarks, we welcome that.
You have a raised hand.
Yeah, there's a raised hand. That's the only thing that I would.
There is a raised,
your
okay.
attention.
Okay, thank you. Pete?
Yes, Madam Manager. Caller with the telephone number ending in 307. Please press *6 now to be heard. Again, phone number.
Yeah, it's Charles Collins. Hey, I had a question I've asked a couple of times. I couldn't get an answer. I was looking, Palm Island and some of the others that undergrounding did it with a special taxing district. And I'd ask if what would be the ramifications of that here, but I never got an answer, so I'll ask it publicly.
What was the question, Charles?
Funding sources, special taxing district or undergrounding. I think Palm Island, Star Island, some of those little islands use it through the county. And what would be the ramifications of that as opposed to bonds?
We have a special taxing district right now for lighting on certain of the streets in Key Biscayne. That's the only special.
It's widely used, very popular. Yeah, I know, but it's not used here a lot. But it's used elsewhere.
Anyway, that's.
So I was asking the village manager earlier what would be the ramifications, and I never got the answer. So I'm asking it here.
So special taxing districts, we've had, to Councilmember Leonard's point, we have one lighting district in the village. It is a way to assess and to collect, but in of itself, the people who are being taxed, if you will, in the special taxing district, there's no separate and apart revenue source. I think that's the distinction. So it's a way to compartmentalize and define a subset of people who are getting a certain benefit.
It's absolutely a revenue source.
There's no other debt. You're not pledging ad valorem revenues. You're not pledging the full faith and credit. It is the folks, the residents that are in that district. So, for example, very common taxing district are guard gates, right? So if you're in a homeowners association where you have a guard and a guard gate, and there might be an assessment of $200 a year, for example, that those residents within the special taxing districts would pay to fund for the infrastructure, and the individual who staffs that guard gate, if you will. But it's not like a funding mechanism. It is still a tax on the residents who are benefiting from that specific service or improvement. What we're talking about here are funding mechanisms, what ways that we can pledge a revenue stream, issue debt to be able to achieve a greater project, right?
Andrea?
Yes,
Andrea?
sir.
I don't think you got your head around it. I'm not going to tie up the meeting with it. I'll talk to you about it personally, but I think you've misunderstood how they operate. Thank you.
I've set them up and taken them over from the on the county, so you know I don't think it's fair to challenge that in this case, but I will happily sit down and talk to you about it.
Okay. Just offering alternatives, and I don't. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember London, was there something that you wanted
No, that
to
was on the special taxing district. It would be a revenue source that you could pledge. Let's assume the undergrounding of electric, and you assessed every home that was undergrounding electric X amount of dollars a year with the ability to lien them if they didn't pay. And obviously you could pledge that to get a bond or loan or whatever else. And then you could pledge every beachfront condo building for all the beach improvements, and they could pay for that. And you could divide the village up into sections depending on who had direct benefits from these things and borrow money against it. So they are a possibility. Probably not. Probably.
I see what you're saying. I see. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Mr. Collins, I hear you. Thank you, Councilmember London. Okay, so now I think we don't have any other callers waiting. On behalf of the Village of Key Biscayne, thank you for joining us this evening. Please do keep your questions coming. We want everybody to be informed and make a good decision on what is best for the village. So thank you and have a good evening. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.